appreciate succinctness before we go to Senator Rosen. We'll start with Dr. Atlas, then we'll go to Mr. Roy, and then to Dr. Katz. Dr. Atlas.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you for allowing that. Just a couple of points of clarification. And these are things that keep being repeated, but they're just misconceptions. Senator Romney said that the curves are not coming down because the number of cases are actually going up in certain states. That's really not a curve to really watch at this point. We know that the more testing we do, the more cases we have. That's not a relevant curve. That was never a directive goal of the policy. The only curves that count are the number of hospitalizations per day and the number of deaths per day, not the number of cases. Second point that is, again, needs to really be clarified. There's somehow a false narrative that's being perpetrated that the people who don't want total lockdown are saying there should be wide open economic and isolation. That's actually not true. No one here is saying that. I don't know anyone who believes that. Everything is about targeted protecting the at-risk people and allowing people to get out who are not in those groups, particularly so that we can increase herd immunity. And then one more point, if I can, about testing. You know, the role of testing is important, but it's very different at various time points in a pandemic. The role of testing in the beginning for South Korea and the urgent needs were very different than it is right now, especially for contact tracing. We have tens of millions of people who have had the infection here. Contact tracing, it seems sort of absurd to me unless it's for preparation of the next pandemic. And then the final point, we keep discarding the massive harms we're killing people with total isolation and lockdown. I don't know how many times this has to be said, but hundreds of thousands of people have serious diseases that are not being treated. And not just that, the economics alone is causing a massive catastrophe that is in terms of health and poverty throughout the world, because many economies are linked, in fact, the whole world, to those of the United States and the Western world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Atlas. By the way, is it Mr. Roy or Doctor? I don't want to.
Mr. Roy is fine. Okay. Is fine. Thank you very much, Senator.
How about Avik?
Yeah,
Roy, go ahead.
Yeah. Similarly, I want to clarify a couple things. First, quickly, Senator Romney, I think, misunderstood my comments of comparing to other types of fatalities. I wasn't comparing to the flu. COVID-19 is clearly more serious than the flu, especially for people over 65 and those with cardiovascular chronic disease. My point was to analogize to traffic fatalities and hospital-acquired infections to say we don't shut down hospitals because 100,000 people die of hospital-acquired infections. We try to manage and mitigate and reduce those deaths. Similarly, with traffic fatalities, we have a whole regulatory system in place and impress upon people the need to be responsible. Those kinds of tools can be relevant here, just as they were in the East Asian countries that recovered from SARS in 2003. I want to make one other comment about the testing discussion we were just having. It's very important. I think a lot of people are under a false impression about just if we have X number of tests, then everything's going to be fine. We have to remember that antibody-based testing or serology testing does not generally measure an active infection. Antibodies only generate in a patient 3 weeks or 4 weeks after they've been infected. So for testing the population to see if they've been infected or they have a current infection, it's not going to work. And the DNA or viral RNA-based testing, RT-PCR tests, those are much more invasive at the moment, much more cumbersome, and very difficult to scale up. So when we talk about the number of testing, I think it's unrealistic to expect massive population-wide testing. And people who are interested in more details about that, we can either get into it in this hearing or you can review the freeop.org paper I mentioned earlier where we delve into this topic at length.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Dr. Katz.
Thank you, Senator. I also wanted to comment on testing, which I've seen up close and personal in the emergency department, and it is cumbersome. And one of the issues we have to overcome is the unreliability of a lot of the tests we're using. There still is a high false negative rate. But it does seem to me we're setting up a catch-22 if any semblance of return to normalcy is predicated on a number of tests we know we can't do and won't be able to do for the foreseeable future. I think we need to ask ourselves, what do we need the data for? We want to know what % of the population is likely to get this infection. Is it everybody who's exposed, or is it 1 in 5? So far, it really looks to be about 1 in 5 on Navy ships, on cruise ships, and contained populations. Of the group that gets this, how many develop symptoms? Of those, how many need to be hospitalized? Of those, how many are likely to need the ICU? Of those, how many are at risk of dying? And on the basis of what antecedent risk factors? How does that shift with the presence or absence of hypertension, coronary disease, type 2 diabetes, body mass index, and other factors? When we think about the utility of data, we really aren't bogged down with testing millions of people. We need a representative random sample large enough to give us that actionable information. That's much more doable. We have the resources to do it now. It's proximal. It's the work of several days. And if the goal of getting data is not just to say, look how much data we have, but look what we now understand to inform policy, representative random sampling will do. The other thing I wanted to say is that there's an alternative to contact tracing. And that is to say, we identify people at higher risk and we carefully protect them from exposure to the virus. And people at low risk, we actually expect the virus to circulate. So contact tracing in that group almost defeats the purpose of saying low risk people, if we're ever going to get our lives back and not be on the indefinite timeline of maybe there will be a highly effective vaccine mass produced, we actually need the virus to circulate among people who can safely get it, get over it, make antibodies, which historically, before the advent of highly effective vaccines, was how pandemics ended, immunity developed. But what we can do now, artfully, is say there are people who cannot safely get through this infection, we'll protect them. There are people who can, they can go back to the world. I think contact tracing at scale in that group is not likely to be helpful. And I think we should do better than contact tracing for the high risk, people over 70, people over 80, people with a large burden of chronic disease. We need to double down on protecting them so they're not exposed until we can document with ongoing, at least random sampling, that viral transmission is near zero, that a high level of protective immunity has been achieved, and then basically everybody's grandparents can hug their grandchildren safely again.